Welcome to Reboot Ideas. My name is Francine Hermelin, and I have the pleasure of putting the Reboot Ideas conversations together. For those of you who don't know, Reboot is an arts and culture nonprofit, a studio, and artist collective with storytellers who reimagine, reinvent, and reinforce Jewish thought and traditions for wandering Jews and the world we live in. We create, produce, and platform film, music, art, writings, and thought leadership to build a relevant Jewish future grounded in the past. This conversation and others like it, hosted by Reboot Ideas, is central to our work. We're the place for the critical Jewish conversations you won't hear anywhere else. To see more of our work, visit our website at rebooting.com. So Reboot believes that integral to the human experience is a constant questioning of who we are, where we sit, and what we do within our society as Jews, as citizens, as inhabitants of the planet. That examination of the Jewish experience is one of the many reasons we are so pleased to bring to you writer, activist, and show creator Sarah Solemani and her show Ridley Road to you this evening. Sarah's gift for telling compelling stories, realizing characters, and shedding light on critical moments in history is a gift she gives to all of us. And key to her brilliance is the fact that she invited the incomparable Jessica Yellin to dive into the conversation with her tonight. After years of guiding all of us through presidential campaigns as the chief White House correspondent for CNN, Jessica is now the founder of News Not Noise and does the news on social media where we all need it most, at Jessica Yellin. So without further ado, Jessica and Sarah, please join us on the screen. Oh, and quick note of housekeeping to all of you. We are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then Jessica and Sarah will take your questions in the Q&A feature, the button at the bottom, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to see myself out.
Thank you so much for that lovely intro. Sarah, thank you for presenting this to the world. Congratulations. You must feel elated, exhausted. How are you?
Hi, Jessica. Thank you for doing this. I feel great. I feel it was a long journey, which we'll talk about. And there were moments when I never thought this show would ever see the light of day. And when we did get it finally greenlit and we started shooting, COVID hit. So we had just sort of struggle after struggle. So the fact that it's out, that it was well received in England, and now it's finally on American television is just immensely satisfying.
Well, we'll get into the process of bringing this to the screen. I thought we'd start, though, first just by sort of laying the groundwork. Ridley Road is adapted from the novel by Joe Bloom in 2014. When did you come across the book, and what made you decide that this is the thing you really feel you should adapt for the screen?
I read a preview of it in a women's magazine, Red magazine, and I bought it as soon as it came out and was really captivated by this period of history and the location, which is very kind of close to my heart, because Ridley Road is a market street in the northeast of London. And it's a sort of melting pot of immigrant communities. And both my Persian Jewish grandma and my English grandma would have done their grocery shopping there, having not, ever met each other. So I knew that there was a sort of bubbling far-right threat, because my dad was like an anti-Nazi League marcher, and there was always sort of the National Front and the BNP. But what I didn't realize, which the novel looks at, is how organized and targeted and legal neo-Nazi presence was in 1962. And we like to think of fascism or Nazism as sort of being over in the 40s, but this was 1962, where it was legal to have swastikas in Trafalgar Square, to talk in anti-Jewish hate speech, and to march in Ridley Road outside Jewish homes and businesses. And not only was it legal, but because they got a permit under freedom of speech, this is before the Race Relations Act, before Hate Speech Act, they had police protection. So the people that came to protest were often the ones that were arrested. And in the novel, the central character, she doesn't become an infiltrator. So that's kind of where the show takes off, where the book ends. And I wanted to take this character and kind of put her into this underworld.
You alluded to it in your opening remarks that this was quite a process to bring it to screen. Would you talk a little bit about what it took and some of the challenges you faced?
I think, the British pride themselves in period dramas and sort of the sort of Austen, Corset, Downton kind of narratives that we love, and I love them too. So for something like this to sit in that space and sort of the kind of period drama space, but really kind of give a searing commentary on the reality of our relationship with fascism, I think it made a lot of people really uncomfortable. And it was also seen as really niche, because there's only 260,000 Jewish people in the United Kingdom. It's a tiny minority, which a lot of people don't realize.
I didn't know that.
Which is kind of alarming, considering how much of our mainstream politics and, you know, the health of our opposition party has been shaped by anti-Semitism or accusations of. So it was just considered niche. It was considered a very niche thing that wouldn't really get an audience, and it got rejected everywhere. But the only silver lining of this kind of global lurch to the right and this embrace of the sort of strongman populist person was that everyone started asking questions. What is happening? Why is it happening? Are we becoming nastier? Are we becoming more stupid? Who are we? And in Ridley Road, even though it's a sort of Jewish girl who's the lead, it was really important to me to kind of humanize these mostly white working class characters who were just very vulnerable to that kind of rhetoric, and you never know if some of them are going to kind of fall. So it was a combination of just being an activist, and being an activist is never accepting no, and being a bit relentless and boring and just knocking on doors and keeping going, and also the changing tide made it. Finally we got there.
It's interesting as you're talking about this. I know you as a passionate activist and person in the world. You're also a gifted storyteller. And when you have to think about telling a story, you didn't just have to humanize the heroes, but you also had to humanize the Nazis to some extent. Was that challenging for you?
Humanizing wasn't challenging because, you know, I sort of live in a sort of far right dystopia most of my life. Like that's when I studied politics. And when you study, I went to Cambridge and did the social and political science tripos, and that's really sort of the philosophy of democracy and how democracy thrives and how it dies. And so I'm always kind of aware of the fragility of it, and it can be eroded, not because anyone set out to be a villain of history, but because people think they are making the right decision in the circumstance they find themselves, or people think they're backing the right person in the circumstance they find themselves. So as a storyteller, I was especially alert to a lot of Jewish stories where the representation of Nazis and fascists seems to be sort of a one-note automaton zombie murderer, which we understand with the benefit of history and hindsight that's how it would have felt. But it's more insidious than that. You know, they say fascism has a changing face. So I wanted to really unpack why a good person could be convinced of bad ideas. And that's why I gave Colin Jordan, who in real life didn't have any children, in this show he has a son, because a lot of his talk is about creating a better world for his child, which, if you unpack any kind of extremist rhetoric, is in their logic trying to make a better world.
Right. Housing plays a role in the show and is deeply relevant to the right. Would you explain a little bit why? And for anybody who hasn't seen the whole show, or give a little bit of context.
So in 1962, it was a really interesting time for housing, because a lot of the Victorian built, a lot of the sort of the industrial housing were regarded as sort of slums and not fit for purpose. So one of my central characters, Nettie, who's this landlady that Vivian, the hero of the story, ends up living with, she's an old age pensioner. She lost 3 sons in the war, and this community that she spent her whole life in is being demolished, and she's the last tenant to leave, and she had to be evicted. And they were building the high rises. They were billed as sort of streets in the sky, these kind of concrete monstrosities throughout London. So if you just imagine, for an old age pensioner, not just the disruption of losing your community, but the noise and the dust and the chaos of space changing. And then imagine that coupled with this new wave of immigration when we brought people from the Commonwealth countries to do very low paid jobs in transport and healthcare, and gave them this accommodation. And you can imagine that, say someone like Nettie is in a high rise, she's with a Bangladeshi and a Pakistani family either side of her. She doesn't understand what they're saying. The lift breaks. You can see how isolated and alienated from your own country you would become, and how vulnerable you would be to reductive ideologies. I think, and so housing is in this show as a thread. It's a thread in all my work. I've written a show called Dude, Where's My Castle, about an aristocrat who loses her castle and ends up in the housing crisis. And I think that's being a vulnerable, having a unreliable income and being in London and being evicted. Once that happens to you, it sort of shapes your outlook. And I don't think actually the left really embrace housing. When you tell the story of housing, you're telling a story of class, you're telling a story of race. We still have a lot of racial discrimination in America for people being denied mortgages. So I told the producers, I was like, this is a show about housing. They went, great, but can you make it sexy? So yeah, that was the task at hand.
Still super relevant. We'll get to the connection to current day, but I want to stay with the piece. You're someone from East London, and I'm curious, prior to reading the book, were you aware of this history?
I knew that there were sort of pockets of threat, but I didn't realize how organized and targeted this movement was. And as the show explores, Colin Jordan ended up being arrested for setting up a paramilitary force. He only got 9 months imprisonment. And that's an armed, trained, uniformed guerrilla army that had a Cotswold convention where they voted him New World Führer. So it's so alarming, and it was perfectly legal for freedom of speech. The paramilitary element wasn't legal, and that's what they got him on eventually. But under freedom of speech, he could do that. And so that's what shocked me. And then when the show came out, what was interesting is the country revealing its thoughts on this issue by its responses to the show, and both left and right media were like, it wasn't as bad as all that. That was kind of a sort of, even though it was well received, it was like she's exaggerating, or she's dramatizing it unnecessarily. It's falsehood. And for me, it highlighted how Jewish people, in a time of identity politics and this reckoning of history, are still often the only minority that aren't allowed to find their lived experience of discrimination, because it was definitely that frightening and that bad for Jewish people at that time, who took to the streets to fight.
Would you, again, just for folks who haven't fully ingested the show or the history, give us a little picture of Colin Jordan?
So Colin Jordan was a Cambridge-educated secondary school teacher, so high school teacher in Coventry, and he was very he was a far-right activist, I guess, from his university days onwards, and he became leader of this movement, the National Socialist Movement. They had a headquarters in Notting Hill with a plaque outside. He was married to Françoise Dior, who was Christian Dior's niece. They got married over a copy of Mein Kampf, and when they spilt their blood. She was this very sort of she's in the show. She's this character in the show, and she had this sort of very glamorous black beret and black suited outfit, and had a sort of diamond swastika on her lapel. I mean, they were actually quite. They were into some weird sexual dark stuff, and I ended up having to lose those scenes because even the BBC were like, "This is too dark to even be in the television show."
Can you give us a taste?
Oh, it was. I mean, it's.
No,
it's like incest. Her daughter committed suicide. I mean, it's dark, heavy, satanic stuff. He, thanks to the 62 group and activists, he was sort of pushed to the fringes of British politics. He ended up being arrested for stealing a pair of women's knickers from Tesco, which is a supermarket store, and being fined for shoplifting. So it was sort of, but he was writing very far right literature into the 2000s before he died.
And paint a little picture of Vivian for us as well.
So Vivian Epstein is a Jewish hairdresser from Manchester. She's a young suburban girl who's never really left her town, and she's been encouraged to marry a man that she doesn't love, and the true love of her life disappears, and she sort of goes on a mission to find him, and that's how she enters this sort of underworld. And in Jo's book, what I really loved was how she had captured these very feminine traits. She loves hair, she loves makeup, she loves clothes. And I wanted to preserve those feminine traits and put them in a sort of espionage thriller story, because often they're regarded as sort of frivolous and they're undermined in cinema, but actually this is her weapon. So she can dye her hair, she can disguise herself, and even the skill of being a hairdresser is to read people and to be able to listen and to understand the human condition. So I didn't want her suddenly like high kicking and being really violent and, you know, all the sass that you often see with like female spy heroes. I wanted that young, vulnerable, feminine energy to be her weapons that gives her success.
Was there anything beyond the things you've mentioned that you found shocking or surprising as you were doing research?
I think what was really surprising was the lack of police or legal protection. So in the show, I look at the death of a young yeshiva boy, a young Jewish student, through a spate of arson attacks throughout the summer of 1962. And in one, a boy died. And there was never an investigation. There was no formal investigation. Only by local residents and the Jewish community campaigning was there any report published. And it revealed that they had found like a bottle of soda, and they called it a house party gone wrong, when all the local residents knew that had been cased by the far right and that boy had lost his life. I'm even getting chills thinking about it. And also how much division that created in the Jewish community, because these men, the 62 group, a lot of them were ex-servicemen. They'd been to the war, they'd fought for their country, and they'd come home and had Nazis on their doorstep. And to not have police protection and to not have the law that could defend you must have been so frightening. And so they took to the streets, and the elders of the Jewish community said, no, you mustn't beat them up, you mustn't use violence. It was a bit like the argument now, if they go low, we go high. And you're sort of bringing our name into the mud, and that kind of that respectful and old school thing of just keep your head down and don't draw attention to being Jewish was still permeating at that time. So the boldness of these activists who had no recognition, who often were anonymous, who did infiltrate under aliases and then disappear, that really did surprise me and inspire me.
I'm wondering if you found parallels between sort of the fascist rhetoric then and what we're hearing today.
Yes. Well, first of all, I didn't have to do much invention, because phrases like "get your country back" were used. That's a popular slogan that people like. Get your country back. And of course,
that was popular then.
That was popular then.
Wow.
Get your country back. And of course, you can't ever get a country back, even if you have an imperialist power that you overthrow. You can only ever move a country forward. So I borrowed, I used that, which often the right adopts, and I was accused of smearing Brexiteers in mainstream media, because it was like, it's an obvious smear on Brexiteers, which wasn't the intention.
Say more about that.
I think it was Peter Hitchens who wrote this piece about it being an obvious smear by the BBC. The BBC is sort of quite, it becomes politicized with the content it puts out. And he felt it was a deliberate attack on Brexiteers, that I'd used this language that Brexiteers had used about getting country back. But actually that's what they used at the time. And then similarly, on the left, the phrase Zionist control, Zionist domination, this global Zionist elite trying to break, even the high street, because it's the dawning of Tesco, which was the main supermarket that was changing the high street. And this is in the show, a lot of anti-Semitic rhetoric around Jack Cohen, the founder of Tesco, destroying things, controlling the banks.
Why he was Jewish.
And he was Jewish, right? And So the dawn of the super, this is the exact kind of entering this idea of one decade fading and another one entering, and the physical landscape changing. So the opening shot of Ridley Road is a horse-drawn rag and bone man kind of moving through the frame, crossing with a Mini Cooper. So one era is fading and another one is emerging, and both left and right phrases were used. I have to say, we managed to agitate pretty much every group in the United Kingdom. The synagogue we shot Ridley Road in, there's a scene later, it was the Manchester Reform Synagogue, that actually became under attack by present day neo-Nazis who joined an online service, changed all their avatars to swastikas and started hurling abuse at the congregants, which was terrifying for them. We managed to upset the right, who thought we were smearing Brexiteers, upset the left because of Zionism critique, and there's one mention of Israel, which you'll see if you watch it. And then there was some Jewish people who didn't like that I did it like as a sort of female lead, and the old school Jewish activists thought it should be a male. So I managed to agitate absolutely everyone.
Wait, they thought it should have been a man?
I kind of did some research, and when there was one man who was he wasn't part of the 62 group, but he did a lot of activist work, and he just couldn't cope. He could get his head around the fictionalizing this woman, and he wanted it to be his story, I guess, right. Which I understand, but he kind of made it very clear that he couldn't support it. So we managed to agitate everyone.
Well done. But it's important, it's important to be able to do that these days, right? Because it triggers conversation. I know that one of the questions you raise is some of the language we use currently, and I'd love for you to talk about the phrase anti-fascist, what you think of that, and if you think we need to reconsider its meaning.
Well, for me and for the show, it was, it's literally a fascist threat. And to understand that term and its origin and its history, I think you really do have to get your head around what a threat to democracy fascist thinking is. And for me, it's less about less worrying about I know there's this sort of idea of Antifa being this kind of violent anarchic presence that's going to smash up the high street, but actually for me it's what fascism itself is, because it's bandied around a lot and people feel like it's being overused, but it really means a reductive ideology that willingly wants to dismantle the democratic system. And we have a really big legacy of that in England with most famously Oswald Mosley, who was this prominent politician. He was in the House of Commons both as a Labour representative and a Conservative representative, and he had a 5-point plan for dismantling the party system, which he thought didn't work in Westminster. And that was taken seriously by a lot of people. And it was the same language: politicians lie, the system is rigged, they're all the same, democracy is a sham. So when you hear from the left, and I hear it from progressive educated people who turn their back on the democratic process because they think it's a sham, for me, that's what true anti-fascism is. It's both protecting minorities, but it's also standing for our democratic right and preserving it. As I said earlier, it's so fragile. And statistically, I think there are far many more people that identify with that allegiance than they do with, balaclavas in the street and putting a brick through McDonald's.
Right. I'm curious, from your work studying this and your knowledge of what's happening today and your passion about political engagement today, first, is there something we can learn from then that we didn't do or that didn't happen that we can act on now, and especially that Jews should be aware of and try to, make noise now? Is that the thing to do? What's the biggest lesson we should learn?
That's a great question. There's one speech that Eddie Marsan's character, Solly Malinowski, says, which is really inspired by Elie Wiesel's Night, which is that, during the Holocaust, or just before the Holocaust, the German trucks pulled up into these towns in Eastern Europe, and they just camped there for 2 weeks, and people learnt their names. And so this idea that, oh, it could get really bad, they're like, no, it can't get bad. We know that, I know him, his name, you know, his hands, he's fine, it's cool. And the Germans would lodge with Jewish landladies and buy them a box of chocolates. They said, it's fine, it's fine. And he says, you see, everything can seem absolutely fine until the moment it's not, and then it's too late, and then they were rounded up. And again, that seems very, very doomsday and catastrophizing. But there are cues, there are red flags. And for modern day, even though anti-Semitism is real and present, it is probably how we treat refugees and immigrants. This idea of this alien force interloping your community, taking your resources, that needs to be controlled. And I do think as a Jewish community, our allegiance as a faith based on the text of refugees, that should be an allegiance, and that we keep mindful of, and very vigilant on the language that's used. That's often very dehumanizing.
It's a signal in the noise about where we might be headed. I want to remind the audience that we'll welcome your questions, and in a few minutes we'll put them to Sarah. So please do add them to the chat if you have any. It doesn't have to be about the show. You can ask her about politics. You can ask her about history. She is deeply knowledgeable and also very funny. So you're not seeing it right now. Sorry, I know that comedians never like that said, right? It puts too much pressure on you. Sorry. I wanted to go back to serious because I'm thinking about, this, how you sort of the state system then allowed for anti-Semitism, right? And didn't really acknowledge it. The protection was on the side of the police force, not on the side of the Jews. And then you talked about how when this came out, it was received with praise, but also, oh, come on, it wasn't that bad for the Jews. And I'm thinking about what I cover in the news today, which is people don't want to hear about anti-Semitism that much because it's not that bad for the Jews compared to everyone else. There's stories about swastikas that show up at school campuses, and people are told, well, they have many meanings in different cultures. Don't be too offended, these kinds of things. And I'm wondering sort of what's your alert level right now? Are you at a red light? Are you at a yellow light?
Well, like I said, my brain is permanently in a fascist dystopia. So I'm always on the, and especially sort of studying it, and it doesn't seem that far away. What the show did was, I realized just in the process of making it, there was lots of obviously non-Jewish people involved in making it. And, little small facts like, most people don't realize that in every single synagogue in the United Kingdom, there is security. And actually, Gerald Ronson, who was a 62 member, runs the CST, which is providing, and often armed, protection on every single Jewish service. You'll very rarely see any Hebrew lettering or a Star of David on the exterior of a synagogue in the United Kingdom, unlike you do here. It's just too dangerous. Eddie Marzan's character Sully says that in the show. People don't realize, and I came across this a lot because part of my family are part of the Lubavitch Haredi community, that a lot of people thought they were very rich. Educated people would say, oh, no, but they're rich, aren't they? And I said, no, actually they live quite, they have a wealthy spiritual life, but materially they obviously on the poverty line. So there was lots of preconceptions, which very easily could lead into this idea of a Zionist presence, and it is to do with Israel, and there's a relationship with America. And I think I have come across this sort of ideological a kind of menu which people just kind of order from in its entirety without unpacking elements, which is, if you're anti-capitalist, you are by definition anti-imperialist, which links America, Israel, and the Jews. And so without much inquiry or interrogation, people will come up with quite strong feelings about Israel, which a lot of Jewish people, not all, but a lot of Jewish people in the United Kingdom feel quite threatened by, because unlike, say, Lebanon or Egypt or Iran, Israel has an emotional response in people that it might not have with any other conflict, and I think Jews find that kind of intimidating.
So beautifully put. You've alluded to this, but I'd be interested to hear you describe. You grew up in the UK. You live in the US. How is the experience of being Jewish different in the UK from the US?
Well, there's more of us
in the US.
In the US, yes, and I'm a Persian Jew, so and there's so many, and I live in Los Angeles, and there are so many Persian people, and there were no Persian Jews unless I was related to them in England, as far as I met. So it's just been, it's just nice to hear Farsi spoken, and that particular Persian Jewish culture. I don't want to generalize too much, but I think Zionism isn't as dirty word here as it is in the UK. The relationship with Israel is different. I think, in my experience on the Jewish people in my community, the recognition of the Palestinian struggle and understanding the Palestinian struggle, that it exists, that they are at an economic and social disadvantage, can exist as alongside the idea that the Jewish people have a right to their own homeland, and both those threads can be sort of investigated and supported, whereas in England it just seems much more conservative. For example, there isn't a patrilineal recognition as much in Jewish. So there was a lot of controversy about Agnes, who's a patrilineal Jew, not being Jewish, she shouldn't have played the role, that kind of thing. And I'm a patrilineal Jew as well, and that I just feel more embraced, I guess, in the US.
Is anti-Semitism more overt there?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of anti-Semitic attacks still. Something will happen in Israel, and kosher products will be just taken off shelves in supermarkets. Wow. It is an issue.
I want to invite people again to ask questions. I see we have a few, but please do add them in if you have them. Let's just turn for a moment to what's next for you. I, in particular, am fascinated that you are turning Mary Trump's book into a TV show. Would you speak about that for a moment? Remind people what the book is, what it's about, and what you're bringing, how you're framing it for us.
Yeah, so Mary Trump wrote a book called Too Much and Never Enough, which is just a fascinating portrait of Donald's life growing up and her family, and just kind of the family dynamics and the things that were going on that kind of shaped who he is now. And when I first read the book, it was just before the election, and weirdly it gave me respite from sort of this sort of panicked, overwhelmed dread that kind of dominated that period. And you start sort of unpacking who he is and why he's the way he is. And the first line of the book is, "Daddy, Mummy's bleeding," because Donald's mum was told by a doctor not to have any more children, and she had Donald, and it caused her a lot of gynecological problems. And the fact that Donald's mum was an immigrant, she was from the Outer Hebrides, the Isle of Lewis, outside Scotland. And she took a ship, like many immigrants at that time, for 6 days to New York City, and she was scrubbing toilets for 5 years. And English was her second language. So the first 20 minutes of the show are in Gaelic and subtitled. So it's really sort of an origin story and an immigrant story. And as well as telling the story of the family, I'm also sewing in kind of the small moves. I would like to call it the triumph of the nobody. I read a quote in a book that said, when people say nobody saw him coming, what they really mean is the people that saw him coming were nobody. Ooh. And I wanted to tell the story of Maxine Brown, the nurse who realized that there was racial discrimination against her because she wasn't let to one of the Trump properties, and she filed a civil lawsuit and was successful. And that was actually Donald's first foray into the public arena as a 17-year-old was being accused of racial discrimination. So I'm threading through lots of different elements, as well as the origin story of Trump. He's not actually in it that much himself.
My gosh, you'd have to cast somebody to play Trump, so it's better if he's not. That'd be so complicated.
Although I just saw an incredible performance of Bertie Carvel in 47th, which is playing now in the Old Vic in London, and it is unbelievable. He comes on stage and it's him. And hopefully it'll transfer to Broadway, but you have to see this performance.
Without it seeming comical or like a caricature?
I mean, he's a very comedic actor. He played Mrs. Trunchbull in Matilda, but Trump is comic. I mean, that's part of his power, is his kind of his eccentricity. But interestingly, in my show, he's a very hard character to write because he doesn't change. Most characters have to sort of have some change. So he's sort of elemental. He's like the wind or the rain. He just is. And in story terms, he's a saboteur. He get in the way of a saboteur and they'll destroy you. But if you understand a saboteur wisely, they will alert you to everything in your life and in the world that needs to be dismantled. So actually, Trump revealed our misogyny. He revealed our racism. He revealed the disparity of wealth, and that's part of the show.
I always said he made what was covert overt. So
right. Yes. I like that.
I want to go to audience questions in a moment, but I just found out that we have the trailer for Ridley Road queued, and I'd love for us to play it so that the audience can see that.
My youngest daughter, the apple of my eye.
Caught in the middle of a fascist march.
Enough is enough!
You just followed me to the depths of hell.
An anti-fascist fights.
You taught me a Jew protects life. They're coming for us, Daddy. I did what needed to be done.
I know what you are.
You don't know anything about me.
Ridley Road on Masterpiece.
Super drama and a blonde Jew. I love it. Thank you for representing. It looks fantastic. And we actually have one of our audience questions is about the process of writing the story. Ari Goldman asked, did you work with a team of writers, and were you researching as you wrote, or was most of the research done before your writing began?
Great question. Thank you. Well, because it was such a long development process, and and I have to say the BBC in the end went for it. Piers Wenger embraced it, and it was thanks to him that it got made in the first place, and Lucy Richer at BBC. But by that point, I really had researched it, and also just researched generally as a citizen of the world, just reading not just in England but extremist trends in the Middle East and India and Eastern Europe, in America, and then we got the green light, and then it was just me writing. I know in Hollywood the trend is more to have a room and a showrunner, but in England it's just smaller budgets, and so normally it's just you on your own at a keyboard sweating about fascism. Which was my
in that room, I understand.
In this shed, which I call my fascist shed.
Why?
Because it's just filled with fascist books. And I told Jessica earlier that my husband actually took a Zoom here when his office wasn't available, and realized as he was having a serious meeting that I had a copy of Mein Kampf behind me, and he had to just kind of wiggle the camera. But always awkward when Mein Kampf is exposed. A lot of research and a lot of rewrites, like any project, just constant rewrites. And Nicola Schindler from Red Productions and Alice Grant, who was a script editor, would just give me notes and say, it's not working, or more of this, less of that, more sexy, less housing, that kind of thing.
Less housing. Okay, this is a question from an anonymous attendee. She says she used to live in the UK and now lives in Canada, and says, it's a bit of a long question, but I'll get there. She says, just this week in Canada, which is experiencing a rise in overt anti-Semitism, their police chief was interviewed and said that anti-Semitic activists are allowed to have freedom of speech. And the police are powerless to do anything until people desecrate Jewish buildings or cemeteries. Then the police can take action. So this person asks, is there a way, in your view, to staunch the new anti-Semitism in this destabilized world? Big question. And what sort of changed in the UK? What caused the decline of the Jewish population there, in your view?
It was never that big. It was always small. So I don't know the exact fluctuations, but it's always been around that mark. Is that what you meant? Sorry.
Yeah, they're saying that when they grew up there, it was about 500,000 people in the 60s and 70s.
Oh, my research had said it was around 300,000, but maybe the establishment of Israel had encouraged people to make Aliyah, like my grandparents did in the 80s. It's such a big question about what to do, and I get asked this a lot, and I'm always loath to put on people that they should, guilt people that should be doing more, they're not doing enough, that it's somehow their fault, because the reality is people are working harder on lower wages and longer hours than ever before. For me, it's about recognizing the fragility of democracy, as I talked about briefly earlier. And if you do feel overwhelmed or frightened, for me, participation, I mean, voting is just sort of the basic step, but participation is such a great antidote to being overwhelmed. To feel that you are shaping the body politic. And when we hear about anti-fascist protests, we think of this idea of never again, never again, never again. But the truth is, it will always be present. It will always be there as a threat, because when people are overwhelmed with the complex global world, they will be something simplistic, which is what fascism is very seductive, and they can get their head around it. So every facet of the body politic has to be kept healthy. Housing matters, education matters, healthcare matters. And when those things are eroded over time, then those beliefs that stem from hate, whether it's Jewish people or whether it's Muslim people or whether it's immigrant people, that it's going to spread like a cancer. So for me, it's you can look at it two ways. You can be terrified that the idea of the democracy that you and I've been born into and our parents have experienced is temporary, and that it could go in our lifetime, right? And I'm Iranian, so we know all about having that power taken away. Or you can look at it as something incredible that you've been given to participate and to have your voice heard and to engage and to feel like how you live and what you care about and who you're voting for matters.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a theory why now? I mean, one could argue we've lived in a complex world with lots of threats for many years, ever since the last spate of fascism. Why is it cresting now?
It's a good question. I do think, and I mean, also the other thing to say is it is on the whole, for us, one of the best times, humanity generally, one of the best times to be alive. We are statistically safer and healthier and living longer than we have before. So I'm kind of try and protect. I'm a very hopeful person, and I don't like to engage in this rhetoric that it's all a decline and what's the point? Not least because studies show that the best way to avoid childhood anxiety is for them to see hope in the adult world. And often parents aren't giving hope for their children because they're dismaying about everything. And if everything's a catastrophe, then nothing's a catastrophe. But I do think a combination of income disparity, false information, and a huge refugee population moving, a displaced population, is a perfect storm for people to start pointing the finger and accusing minorities of disrupting things.
Mm-hmm. There's an audience question about hate speech. This person says that in one of your answers, they interpreted what you're saying to mean that people should be legally protected from hate speech, that hate speech should be legislated against. In the US, hate speech is protected, and they're asking, would you change this? And how do you think this plays out online?
It's a really interesting topic because who decides what hate speech is, right? And how could that be weaponized to something that doesn't serve people in a kind of healthy way? But I think what my show was looking at, particularly now when we're talking about freedom of speech and this idea of being censored and that you can't say anything in cancel culture, when you look at before you had hate speech legislation, and you could stand in Trafalgar Square and whip up hate to the point that there were arson attacks and people lost their lives. It's very hard to make the argument that under freedom of speech, even hate should be free to be spoken. But it is an interesting one, and I think we should always be questioning what we are allowed to say, and actually protecting people's right to say it, even if it's not hateful, but we don't like it, we don't agree with it, still fight for their right to say it.
So you would draw a line at hate. So distasteful rhetoric, yes, but something that the government determines is hateful speech should be legislated against?
I think something that could cause violence, something that's insinuating that someone's humanity should be removed, which is what a lot of racists, one of the challenges of the show was to try and find more interesting things to say, because it's the same thing over and again. It's their fault, they shouldn't be here, the reason we're doomed and the reason we've lost what we had is because. And I had to really search for something intellectual for Rory Kinnear, who's a fantastic actor, to sound interesting, because it's actually not, it's very simplified. But the language that dehumanizes someone, that could incentivize someone to cause violence, I think is problematic.
And they asked how this plays out online. I'll put that in a little more context. Do you think, there's this big debate now about whether Twitter, for example, should be barring people who use hateful language or not. As an artist and somebody who values communication and being able to put stuff out there, where do you stand on that?
I think it's really tricky, and I think we should keep talking about it. It doesn't feel right that some right-wing pundits maybe feel censored, because it just goes underground. And I think the antidote to problematic speech is more speech, but I think it's also about how we formulate ideas, and we actually formulate ideas not just by holding them in our head, but actually speaking them, and hearing the reaction. You and I have had debates over the years, and I've actually been able to refine my thoughts depending on what you're saying to me. So dialogue helps our thought. And the tricky thing about social media is that it's something you just sort of fling out and either get destroyed on or supported on. So we're not actually deepening our knowledge and our understanding. But that doesn't say it isn't a very useful tool that I'm hugely excited by still.
I don't know if this is a question you can answer, but we can play with it. When I have conversations about the rise in fascism around the world today, one explanation I'm given frequently is social media. Social media has helped people who have fascist tendencies find one another, feel community, and then strengthen that identity, right? And then go from feeling confident in it to taking action. And I'm curious if you think that has it makes it harder to defeat fascism than it was in the era Ridley Road is about.
That's really interesting. I read a thing with Sam Harris, who I adore, who had said, I think it was something like someone was threatening to throw an ice cream on him, and he felt like it was an assassination attempt. It was that pitch. And when I think of seeing something on social media or feeling kind of attacked, and then being on the street with a Nazi and a metal pole waiting to beat you, and my dad, once was roughed up by, far right people, and they took his yarmulke and called him a filthy Jew. And I said, what happened? Where did you go? And he said, oh, I went to my dad. And I said, what did your dad say? He said, well, he told me off for losing my hat. It was just I think it can feel very frightening, but it isn't the same as being physically attacked. on the street. You have legislative protection on that. So I'm sympathetic to it, but I think you have to adapt to the tools of your age. And as long as those people aren't taking that to the street, which may be a consequence of it, then we just have to fight with putting out more knowledge and making more conversation and having more dialogue, rather than shutting these people down for being stupid and evil, which the left do have a tendency to do, which I don't think helps anyone.
It's very optimistic of you. And you had said that before we started, you said you want me to ask you about hope. You mentioned hope earlier, but I wonder if you'd like to explain why that's important to you and what you want people to know.
I am very hopeful, even though I live in a fascist utopia.
It's a contradiction.
But I am hopeful because even just your last election, I thought was an incredible gesture of resilience and triumph. Because most democracies that have someone like Trump in office don't get them out. They really don't. And you did. And where there is life, there is hope. And also, what's the alternative? We are alive. It is a gift to be alive. It is a gift to have a voice. It is a gift to have this conversation. It's a gift to live in a democracy, however flawed and problematic and in room for improvement it is. But that's the nature of democracy. It is the least bad form of government. It is by nature inefficient and has ebbs and flows. And we have to protect it and protect everyone within it, because the alternative really is nightmarish. So I just feel very, like I said, I read the study about children and anxiety, and luckily, touch wood, I have children that are very hopeful because they see that in their parents, who enjoy being alive and enjoy celebrating life, which is a very Jewish mentality.
I think that's a beautiful place to wrap this conversation and let people go watch Ridley Road, which starts in just a few moments, I think. Sarah, thank you for your voice and your passion and sharing your creative gifts with us.
Thank you, Jessica. That was a beautiful interview. I feel very honored to be interviewed by you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Jessica and Sarah, thank you so much. When we started thinking about having these Reboot Ideas conversations and sort of like lifting the veil on what had historically been private conversations where we think about Jewish identity and meaning and what we want to do with it, we knew that it was the power of those conversations that would be like kind of the most important piece of the work. And it sort of speaks to what you're saying, to just keep asking questions, keep talking about things, maybe pissing a bunch of people off along the way, which you said you did with your work. But I think in that there's hope and there's forward momentum. And listening to the two of you was just incredible and so uplifting, because you both went to places that you didn't necessarily know the answers to. So like, thank you so much for taking us with you on that journey. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and you've got 2 minutes on the East Coast to tune into Masterpiece Theatre right now to go watch Ridley Road. And we just put the link into the chat. And in a couple of weeks, come back, because we will be in conversation with Pam Tanowitz, an incredible choreographer who's setting her first ever piece to a biblical piece of text. So come back for that. Jessica, Sarah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Reboot. Thank you.